I'm here today, and thank you for inviting me, Josh, to talk a little bit about my story and also to tell you some of the things I've learned while doing the research for my book, Secrets and Lies. In my book, I make a distinction, it's not deep, between finders and keepers. The finders are the people whose lives are totally changed by what they've discovered, and the keepers are the people who are keeping that truth to themselves. I call it secrets and lies because in order to keep a secret, you have to lie. When people are angry at somebody for keeping a secret, how come you lied to me all these years? The answer is, duh. How was I going to keep the secret if I didn't lie, make up stories, so on and so on? Now, I wrote this first book, Walking on Eggshells, which is about the relationship between parents and their grown children when my sons were in their 20s and they weren't returning my phone calls. And I wrote the second book, Mom Still Likes You Best, about the relationships between grown siblings, because my brother and I had not gotten along very well. By the time my first book was out, my kids were calling me. And by the time my second book was written, my brother and I were close again. I had missed him so. You break off with a relative and you say, it's okay, we're broken off, it's phantom limb. That's another story. And the Secrets book came from my own life too. And it was the most crucial and important emotional book for me to write. And that's because I was both a finder and a keeper. My husband of 15 years, of up-and-coming psychoanalyst, at the end of a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, confessed to me that he was gay. And I didn't know. I had no idea. We'll talk about repression later. We had two sons, 8 and 12. And we lived in New Haven, Connecticut, a very small town. And he loved me and I loved him, and we were not ready to separate or divorce. And we decided, we were in San Francisco. Can you imagine? San Francisco is the place. We were in San Francisco. We took the plane home to New York, and by the time we got home, we decided to stay married and keep this from our sons, who were 8 and 12. So I went from being a finder to a keeper. Now, when you are faced with a reality that you never expected, the image that comes to mind now is you're in a car and you're at a red light, and somebody comes over and takes a bat and smashes your window. Shards, glass, you can't see very well, you certainly can't think. That is the impact, was the impact on me of finding out this truth. What were we going to do? What was life going to be? How are we going to survive? What about the kids? Well, we made this decision to become keepers. And then we entered into 9 years. We didn't tell our sons until they were grown. 9 years of keeping a secret. Now, on the one hand, we had a shared secret now, so we were conspirators. And that made us closer. On the other hand, I was lying to my sons and to my family and to my colleagues and to my friends. And I found that the experience of not being able to share your truth is really hard. Here's what happens. You can't be relaxed with anybody because, God forbid, a subject should come nearby and you might be tempted to tell the truth. You become a listener, not a talker. I got very good. I'm a good listener, but I had all my friends' stories. They didn't know what was going on in my life. I got sad because I was lonely. One of the things about having friends is you share things. And I couldn't share. And by this time, Dick had found the love of his life. And I was happy for them to be together. Although we were still married, they would have evenings, weekends, and trips together. But I was lonely. And after our second son went to college, I couldn't stand it anymore. What kept me a good secret keeper was the fact that I had this idea that the family came first. Jewish mother, family comes first. I'll take the neck, make a chicken. But when Josh went to college, the house got like a morgue. And so Dick and I decided to get divorced. And it was an amicable divorce. And then we had made an agreement that Dick would stay in the closet. Now, this was hard for him, but good for him, because being a psychoanalyst, he would have been kicked out in 1979 of the American Psychoanalytic Association. We would go to, and he was writing books about gay men, and he was a pioneer on getting the psychoanalysts and the psychiatric community to say this isn't an illness. He'd been in he'd been in analysis for 9 years, and of course it hadn't cured him. He thought it would. And when he realized what was going on with him and with his patients and so on, he joined with the ACLU, and they went after the American Psychoanalytic Association and got them to admit gay candidates. But before that happened, I was his beard. He would make lectures to the psychoanalysts, and there was one especially homophobic man. I would sit behind him and watch his neck get redder and redder. It was 50 shades of red, I've got to tell you. So it was good for him professionally, and it was also okay for him because he had Gordon. It was less good for me. But I had the other things. My own internal life was not so great. And then when we got divorced, we were getting divorced, Dick came out to the world, and everybody knew. And he went to the doctor. He was so worried because the family was breaking up. He loved being in the family. And he went to the doctor. He was worried about his health. His father had died of a heart attack. And the doctor said, "Richard, what's happened to you?" And he said, "Well, I'm getting divorced." And he said, "Your blood pressure is perfect. Your pulse is lower. You are in such better health." So keeping this secret from the world had a terrible impact on his physiology. So that's my story. Now, writing my book, doing the research for my book, I interviewed people all over the country who had secrets, who had been told secrets, finders and keepers. And the people who spoke with me were incredibly kind and courageous to tell me their stories. But because I had my own experience, I think I had a lot of empathy. And so it was cathartic for them to tell me their stories. And I found that the thing that made the finders angriest was the lies, not the secret. I found that when first comes the fact, this is a fact, something happened or I am something. Shame, secret. Once you have the shame and you must keep the secret. This is not a decision. Should I tell? You're afraid of your life. Once you have decided to keep the secret because of the shame, there's no way to get around lying. Well, and there are these negotiations people make with themselves. Well, I'm not going to tell today because it's raining. Well, the sun came out. I'm going to wait till next week. And weeks and months and years go by. And then when the secret comes out, sometimes people tell, sometimes it emerges. One of the people I interviewed was the unfavorite daughter in a family of 3 girls. And she was in graduate school when the letter came from her birth mother saying, "You need to know you were adopted." And she didn't know it. And it changed her life. And she was furious at her parents for not telling her. And what happened for her was that the minute she knew, she understood why they didn't treat her like the other girls. And she had looked at her high school graduation picture, and she remembered saying to herself, "Well, our ears are the same, so we must be the same family." And in that case, and in so many other cases, the secret comes out not from the keeper, but from another person. However it happens, when the secret comes out, we're in a crisis. People, when things go bad in a family, I have found from my 10 years of research and speaking, when you have a fight with your grown child and you hang up, whap, you think you're never going to see that person again. It's over. A week later, it's better. And in my experience with secrets, if the keeper has the courage and the fortitude and the self-understanding to tell the whole story, to come out, provide the context, to apologize fully, even to repent. I'm Jewish, so it's a Yom Kippur thing. You know you have betrayed somebody you love, and you want to keep that relationship. So you go through these stages of telling, and then the person comes back and says, well, what about that night? And you say, well, this is what happened that night. And you say, why didn't you think of that? And you say, this is why I didn't think of that. And over time, the crisis eases, and you get a relationship if you want it. Now, I have a chapter about adultery in marriages. And in many of those cases, the partner who's having an affair really wants out of the marriage. And that's a way to do it. But if somebody has an affair and wants to stay married, then what I've just told you has to take place. This pattern of conversation and of reconciliation. For the finder can only really understand this given a context, given a narrative. We all know, this is nothing new, humans are narrative story makers. Here we are on a story day. Being able to create a story out of a series of facts, some of which you expect and some of which you don't expect, makes it possible for you to get used to it, to reconcile to it. And that is the most important finding of that's one of the most important findings of my research. Now, Dick never really told me the whole story. And by the time my book was done, unfortunately, he was dead. So my sons told the story of his life at his funeral in the narrative of his creation, not in the narrative that I would have created. Well, they'll tell my story at my funeral. But for the finder, being able to find a context is the most important. For the keeper, the relief of no longer having to walk around, to avoid, to miss a conversation is, and that is such a great relief. And when you're keeping a big secret, the image that I had, in an airport, in the ladies' room, there's just a wall of doors, and some open and some close. When you're a secret keeper, all those doors are locked. Every entry to yourself is closed. When you are able to come to terms and come out of your secret, whatever it may be, you find who you are. You've suppressed who you are. Now, there's another part of it, which is the second half of my story. After Dick and I were getting divorced, I refound the love of my life. I had been forced to give him up because my mother wanted me to marry a doctor. Anybody ever hear that? And he dropped out of medical school. And I married my doctor, and he went into the book publishing business. And so I heard about him because my parents and his parents were friends. And when I got to New York Publishing, I had lunch with him, and I thought, oh, he's just as smart and adorable as ever. He was married, I was married, nothing. As Dick and I were getting divorced, it turned out that Jonathan's marriage was breaking up too. And we got together on a New Year's Eve. And we had 21 wonderful years. Now, he was, of course, mad at me for having dropped him 30 years before and so on. We had a wonderful marriage. A complicated marriage, a living marriage. I don't think there's anything, I think marriages need to be alive. And if you fight, if you don't fight, if whatever, if they're living, they're good. And then Jonathan became ill, and he had a month to live. He was given a diagnosis. He had a month. And this was a man who had to take a Xanax to get a physical. When he heard that he was dying, he accepted it. It's bizarre, he said. I took him home from the hospital to die. Hospice was there, the bed. My sons were helping. And it was strange because he repressed everything. But we were able to talk about his life. I was able to repair some of the relationships that had gone sour for him. I got in touch with some people who had hurt his feelings. They wrote him. They called him. I got them to send emails. At some point, Jonathan said, "This is the prequel." And I said, "Well, you know, Jews believe that the spirit hangs around at least through Shiva, so you'll see the main event." And we talked about everything. He told me there were two things he was going to regret. One was our grandson Benji's bar mitzvah, 7 years hence, and the other was the Academy Awards. And as he got sicker, he wasn't well much of the time, and so we had a few hours a day where we could talk, and the light was low, and I call those my honey hours. We were storing the intimacy. We were storing the love in an emotional hive, and I knew I would have that forever. And at the end of his life, he died on New Year's Day. It was just 21 years after we had found each other. At the end of his life, I knew that if we hadn't been able to do this, our relationship would never have been what it was. The ability to face together a hard fact is one of the great equalizers, one of the great creators of closeness. So at the end of it, I came to realize that as hard as this was, and you know, it's about as hard, it's almost as hard as it gets, not quite. As hard as it was, I knew that I was standing on firm ground. And I said to myself day after day, at least I know. I can deal with it sometime. At least I know. And this is the mantra that I offer for people who are in the mix, in this life-interrupted moment of secret keeping and secret telling. At least I know. We are humans. We are able to adapt to anything except maybe climate change, but we're not doing that today. We can make lives for ourselves with the people we love in ways that we may not anticipate we have the strength, so long as we know. The family, however you construe it, is the spaceship of the human species. Our relationships of love over time do not go away just because somebody's behaved in a way that is hurtful. What do you do with the love after you have been betrayed? It's a good question. Well, you deal with it because at least you know the love is still there, the betrayal happened, life goes on. And so I finished this little story and analysis, again, with the architecture, shame. It could be I didn't get my BA. Or it could be I was a felon. Secrecy, lies, lack of intimacy, separation, truth, pain, crisis, and if you're very, very lucky, resolution. Thank you.
So you and your husband kept a secret for 9 years.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, do you wish you hadn't? Or do you wish the time had been shorter? I can understand why it was kept to start with.
You know, that's a wonderful question. Did everybody hear it? No. I get asked that question all the time. And my answer is, I don't know. We made the decision out of love. We really did it for the children. We wanted those boys to have a regular life. It wasn't a normal life, a regular life. One of them is a MacArthur-winning founder of StoryCorps, and the other is a leading political consultant in New York. They're okay. And they were extremely close to their dad all his life. And we have a family that is fine. Was I in pain those 9 years? Not as much as you might think, because you can put something on a back burner. You say, well, I'm not going to think about it today. I'll work harder. At some point, I decided I wanted to learn biblical Hebrew, which is a hard thing to do for somebody who doesn't know the script. But it gave me something to concentrate on. I always needed a project. Now I don't have to work so hard because I'm not putting things away. And the answer, if we had told them in 1979 in New Haven, Connecticut, I don't know what would have happened, but that's called a counterfactual conditional. Anything else? Okay. Oh, wait.
So just because I'm really short, just to follow up, so you talked about doing it for your son's sake. Your sons are perfectly capable of articulating themselves, obviously. So what feedback have they given to you? Because you talked about the idea of if I had just known.
Right.
Do they have an experience with if I had just known themselves? I'm sure they
did.
Yeah.
And here's the story of the boys. They were 18 and 22. Not, you always call your children the boys if they have sons. We told David some clues had happened we had to tell him. And he looked at us and he said, I've lived a life of lies. And he slammed the door. We didn't hear from him for 6 weeks. And to this day, he thinks we should have told him. He's just started a speaking out program at StoryCorps where he's collecting the stories of LGBTQ people, especially the older ones. And he's doing it in his father's honor. Josh hadn't been the good, perfect boy that David had been. So when we told him, he had a little more empathy, we thought. And David called him. He knew he was going to hear. And he said, you want to come, David lived in the village, you want to come down to my apartment and talk? And Josh said no. He said, I don't want Dad to think I don't love him. Many years later, I asked him how he got the courage and the beauty to say that. And he looked at me across a lunch table and he said, I didn't want to lose my dad. So, and later I heard he told his friends, my nuclear family exploded. And I think Josh understood more of why we had done it. David to this day, but then he spent his whole life finding other people's stories. So he's made good out of it. He's turned it into lemonade. Thank you. Okay.